Regulators in Southeast Asia are moving fast, like bustling ants, building tighter and smarter chemical frameworks. Today, we follow their trail. Like a pangolin, we dig deep and pull out the key regulatory artifacts shaping the region. From dinosaur-sized frameworks to microscopic compliance details, the regulatory landscape is anything but static. Let's unpack it with Anas, Danial from Henkel and Fabien Henry from the Nickel Institute. Gentlemen, what are the key drivers behind the tightening of chemical regulations across Southeast Asia?
I think what we see is more or less the same as it used to be. There's still this need to address human health, environmental protection, strong pressure on sustainability. And what I would say and highlight is the emergence of new drivers that act a bit as catalyst. You have on one hand the global frameworks on chemicals, with very ambitious targets and the means to support its implementation. Industry had strong commitment towards achieving some of these targets. And you also have something quite new in the recent years, which is OECD membership. And we see a couple of ASEAN member states with really keen interest in becoming OECD members.
Okay. Anas?
Yeah. In addition to that, I would add a bit more that apart from the trends, not really trends, I mean the setup of the UN Global Framework of Chemicals, we do see how globally trends and issues that are affecting the perception of people about chemicals, such as PFAS, do shape the attention of our authorities in figuring out what will be their next steps in managing the chemical regulations within the respective borders. And this is also one of the things that we are seeing as driving these readjustments of the regulations that we are seeing within Southeast Asia.
Okay, let's take a tour through Southeast Asia and let's begin in Vietnam. The Komodo dragon of regional regulation, large, powerful and a bit unpredictable. What has been the biggest practical shift since the new law on chemicals entered into force in January 2026?
Quite a few things, I would say. There is first this the broader scope around life cycle that goes way beyond just a hazard substance centric scheme. There is a broader custom declaration requirements that now apply to any substance covered under HS Chapter 28-29. There is also the introduction of requirements for hazardous substances in goods and finished products. There is also all the new requirements for new chemicals, which is a big part of this new law in Vietnam.
And what is actually considered a new chemical in Vietnam?
So, in Vietnam right now, what is considered a new chemical is a chemical that is not listed on the National Chemical Inventory and also not listed in 3 foreign inventories, namely I think for EU, the US and Japan. There are a lot of inconsistencies that maybe we can discuss later. But yeah, this is the main things. What's lacking as well is maybe a consideration for exemption from the new chemical identification. And yeah, I don't know if Anas, you want to add to it?
Nothing much to be added on the definitions of the new chemicals. But clearly, I would like to also highlight that within this implementation of the new chemical law, there have been reclassifications of the chemical substances from the previous chemical law, particularly those listed under the annexes of Decree 113 that have been reassigned, I would say, under the new decrees under the current chemical law. And in a way that does affect previous classifications, previous type of licenses that these substances would have required when it shifted into the new law. So that's basically some of the things that, the change in the classifications of these chemicals,
Okay. Hey, and how are companies coping with the new chemical assessment and notification requirements before market entry?
Yeah, okay. So basically right now, many companies, I believe, I would say even all companies right now are reassessing the existing chemical inventory that they have. That's something that we all have to do right now. My company in particular are heavily invested in this, since we do have a manufacturing facility and we import regularly products from our plants outside of Vietnam to be sold to our customers. So these studies that we call these compliance check assessments, compliance assessments to re-evaluate the existing product portfolios that we have, matching it against the new one. Clearly, one of our major challenges right now, as these are brand new things, these documents that we have are all coming from the government. So many agencies, what something in the past few years have been things that we could have done automatically with digital tools and things like that, becomes a fresh series of paperworks for these companies to re-evaluate the statuses of their products. And in doing so, upon completion of these re-evaluations, assessments, only then can we move to the next step of applying the right licenses, updating the hazard classifications and communication documents as well, such as the SDS and labels of our products respectively.
As always, the devil is in the details, or perhaps the Tasmanian devil. How do the new degrees and circulars interact with custom practice, especially on the full composition disclosure and protection of CBI, confidential business information?
Right, a very hot topic, I would say. As I mentioned, they have broadened the scope for custom declaration. And even since a few years ago, we had problem at the customs. Namely, requests were made on disclosing full composition for product entering Vietnam, which is not necessarily aligned with the provision in the law. And the means to do that was usually to request full disclosure using the safety data sheet, which is not the appropriate way to do that. There's been a number of engagements between industry regulators in different forums, whether it's in the ARCP in ASEAN or even in APEC. There's been countless initiatives. There's been a project led by Singapore in APEC to look at what are the best practice for custom clearance, what is the appropriate use of the safety data sheet, which is intended to be a hazard communication material. So only information on hazardous components should be disclosed in Section 3 under very specific rules that are prescribed in GHS and implemented in each jurisdiction. And this is something that needs to be aligned between authorities responsible for the chemical law and customs. And I think there is a bit of a gap between the two, a lack of coordination, and there needs to be more dialogue, more discussion, more cooperation to find the proper way to address this, to find the proper channel for foreign suppliers to be able to submit in a secure channel all the information that is needed for customs to clear the product, while really ensuring that CBI are respected and protected.
Anas?
Yeah, to add to that, I believe what we are seeing, for me, what I can call this is basically now that there's this brand new regulation implemented in Vietnam, customs are like standing its ground as using a provision that they have within the regulations that state that they can request for more information for customs clearance. They are, at the moment, it seems they're fully maximizing this role. To an extent, it's going beyond what has been normally practiced over the years. Now, what I have learned is that there are two circulars that have been issued around late May, early June by the Vietnam Ministry of Industry and Trade through the Vietnam Chemicals Agency to explain about the roles and responsibilities of each of these agencies that are involved in implementing the Vietnam chemical law. So we are, let's see how through the implementation of these new circulars, what will be the next actions taken by customs for clearances, hopefully for the best.
Okay, thank you. Fabien, where do you still see uncertainty or inconsistencies in implementation?
And a number of things. If we get back to the definition of new chemicals and the listing in foreign inventories, it is unclear, and there are inconsistencies between the decrees, the circular. For example, if a substance is listed on a foreign inventory, the decree, I think, states that there should be a simplified process, simplified assessment, while the circular seems to completely ignore this and require full report for a substance that are listed on foreign inventories. There are, as I mentioned, lack of exemption route for new chemicals. There is also a need to categorize into 3 different categories, and none of them is a path for low hazard chemicals. So there's a number of gaps and things that still remain to be addressed. I believe a lot more information is expected from the regulators. They talked about having more detailed guidelines on how things would play. So I think we're a bit on the expectation on this topic and hopefully learn more tomorrow.
Okay, now let's move to Singapore, at least in the interview. We're already there, of course. A system in Singapore is known for precision. What does good compliance actually look like in practice under Singapore's chemical reporting framework?
Right, so Singapore Chemical Reporting Framework, which I think came into force in January this year, which basically requires hazardous substance license and permit holders to report a certain amount of information when renewing their license or permit. There are certain conditions to be met to report. First one is it applies to pure substances as such or in mixtures. It applies to substance, I think, above 1 metric ton per year and with a certain hazard criteria. Either acute tox category 1 or 2, aquatic acute category 1, CMR category 1A, 1B, and 2, and if I'm not mistaken, P and B, persistence in bioaccumulative substances. And if you meet this criteria, then you have to disclose a number of information on chemical identity, submit the safety data sheet, expected volume, and intended use. And everything is done through a portal, a platform, and a form that is available online. So everything is quite streamlined and straightforward.
Thank you. Anas, does that mean that Singapore is becoming a regional benchmark for digital reporting and transparency?
Yeah, my take on this is, while I do like the framework that Singapore implemented recently, but still, I cannot say that it is becoming the benchmark in where other countries are adopting it. It seems each countries are still preserving their existing reporting frameworks or basically coming up with their own reporting frameworks. But hopefully, in the long run, with more interaction between these member states of ASEAN, basically among the regulators and also the industry are doing that. Definitely, we do hope that best practices on chemical reporting frameworks can be realized and be adopted by all the member states.
Okay, then let's go to your Malaysia, because also their systems are evolving rapidly. What is the practical value of the integrated industrial chemical management system, IICMS?
Yes, yeah. So, yeah. Firstly, I'll tackle this from a regulatory perspective. As explained by them, consolidating all the 3 regulations under the purview of the Department of Occupational Safety and Health reporting platforms into a single one basically streamlines their process. And beyond streamlining a process, it gives a better bird's eye view for them when zooming in into each of the chemical players in the country. So it's not just knowing where their information has been submitted or not on an annual basis, which comes from the SIMS report, but also even before going to their respective sites, they would already know what they can expect based on the chemical register. Now, because right now, chemical registers reside on site, and there's no digital platform where these are required to be uploaded by these respective companies for DOSH to see. There's only the SIMS report there. So this is one of the things that they're trying to harmonize. And also the notification of CIMA, which is for the control of the industrial major accidents and hazards, notifications, processes, identifications of sites. This will enable them to streamline and have this better bird's eye view on this matter. Now, from the industry perspective, I would say in doing this, one way, it consolidates all our reporting needs into a single platform as compared to having multiple platforms. Even under DOSH, with SIMS, it's a separate one. They even have their MyKKP for other types of DOSH-related reporting requirements that has been implemented. So this consolidation will help us just to use a single platform for any reporting on our end. But of course, there's going to be a bit of a challenge. For example, based on the practices of each of these companies on how and who are responsible for each of these regulatory reporting. So this is something each company will need to figure out on how to do that moving forward.
Okay, you say you're happy with a consolidated system at DOSH, but there is of course also DOE. What is your experience with their MyEHS registration system?
Yeah, so yeah, MyEHS basically is, first it stands for, previously it was the EHS&R reporting system. But back then the EHS&R reporting system was very specifically based on the what we call environmentally hazardous substances, an old regulation voluntarily implemented back in 2009 when it started. But with the move to MyEHS, it demonstrates DOE's focus, to not only focus on not only to touch on those previously designated environmentally hazardous substances, but also to align DOE and in particular as Malaysia's national authority or national focal in implementing international chemical conventions such as Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata under one roof. So in this way, the implementation of the MyEHS system upgrades what was there before in the EHS&R so that all the reportings, all the notification applications that is required from DOE for import and export activities are consolidated under one room, under one platform. And this, in a way, does help pretty much the industries because when accessing MyEHS, you already can see what are the items that are under its scope. And there are guidelines for us in the industry for whatever notification that we are applying for, such as the export notification or the explicit consent that we need to submit for importation. All these are in place within the MyEHS, and that's pretty helpful.
Okay, and how do companies like Henkel practically manage overlapping requirements between DOSH and DOE?
Yeah, okay. This is of course still another challenge, because these are separate platforms, separate regulations, and from time to time you do see there's an overlap whereby for DOSH, for instance, anything that's hazardous is under their scope. And still under DOE through its hazardous substance division, while the focus is mainly on environmentally hazardous substances, it is still hazards that are basically in a way overlap between DOSH and DOE. So we do see things that are environmentally hazardous. We still need to submit those information through the SIMS annual reporting process to DOSH. And you have this as well through the MyEHS under DOE. So what we companies do, we still need to comply with these requirements. Luckily, right now, luckily, maybe that's not the well. The thing is, right now, while MyEHS is still not yet mandatory, so the environmentally hazardous substances reporting that is under their scope is not something that we must do every year. The push is there by DOE to get these companies to carry it out.
So lots to manage in Malaysia. Let's continue and move further north. Thailand's Hazardous Substances Act. How predictable is the listing and classification process under this system?
Yeah, this is one of the, I find it interesting that while it is a standard activity by Thailand, we do see that every year or every 2 years or so, there are updates into the lists of chemical substances that are being managed by Thailand, the IW, or even FDA and the other agencies that are 6 agencies that fall under the work platform of review of the Thailand Hazardous Substance Act. So at the same time, what we see, each of these updates that come from them basically are their attempts in aligning to what globally is happening as well, such as the updates whenever the Stockholm POP lists gets updated. So Thailand does subsequently update their lists of hazardous substances along with it. Yeah, and we can see that. So looking at that, every time we can see there's a global update, within these international conventions, or there are some big items such as PFAS that's capturing the attention globally, or some regions such as North America or Europe in particular. We can anticipate that in the coming years, Thailand, through its lists, will also do some announcements on its updates for these lists of hazardous substances as well.
Okay. Hey, and what are the main challenges with multi-agency approvals like DIW and the FDA?
Yeah. Looking at how they are practiced right now, while there is a clear demarcation between FDA and the IW and all the other agencies, for example, and their own lists of substances that under their control, challenges do occur because everybody seems to use the same nomenclature when it comes to the type of licenses, type 1 to type 4, that they issue. But clearly, there's going to be different requirements when you apply for each of these licenses. And that's where, for companies whose products fall under multiple jurisdictions of these agencies, it's very important for us to maintain proper portfolios of our products. And within these portfolios, particularly when we're looking at the portfolio for our license applications, it must also be clear as well, due to different requirements under each of these agencies. So as long as we practice these, we are able to reduce as much friction as possible when we are carrying out our license applications. And at the same time, we do need to regularly contact the respective agencies for clarification on the documents that we have submitted, or even also the status of the submissions of our licenses, and so on and so forth. As under each authority, they also have different lead times in processing them.
Okay. Fabien, we hear about delays and customs challenges, especially linked to the composition disclosure. What practical solutions would you suggest for addressing CBI concerns while maintaining regulatory control?
Right. So we already discussed the problem that we saw in Vietnam. I think in Thailand, there's a bit of a different issue that we see. Often companies have very long lead time when applying for CBI with the IW. Here, there is a problem, I think, of lack of manpower, which leads to a very long time. There is a strong need to regularly follow up with them as well to know if the right document were submitted. But things that we see lacking in Vietnam are kind of in place in Thailand. There is a proper process. There is a way for foreign suppliers to submit their information to the IW. It's just a very long lead time to get processed. And this is maybe where the specific tools could be used to streamline the process, to make it a bit more efficient. And here, it's really a matter of resources, I believe, to try to reduce this time for CBI claims and clearance.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Both Thailand and Indonesia are moving through OECD accession processes. How is this shaping their regulatory frameworks?
So I think there's always been a drive from those two countries to address chemicals management, and probably OECD speed that up. We see now Thailand working with dedicated budget on a number of things. We expect them, of course, to implement full good laboratory practices, as well as the need to identify existing chemicals from new chemicals, which will lead to finalization of a chemical inventory from the AWU, I believe, and then probably look at what is happening globally on risk-based approach for prioritization, for risk assessment. So we do expect, after finalizing an inventory, to start really working hard on risk assessment. And here I think OECD is a good platform to really make information more available and to really put more drive for regulators to act on it. What we hope is that it is not rushed and that there is a specific context in Thailand, like in Indonesia, there's a need for specific tools, for approaches that are deployable. We talked about lack of resources for CBI. The same will happen when they start conducting risk assessment or reviewing risk assessment. So there's approaches, flexibility that is still needed while maintaining alignment with best practices with OECD legal instrument. There is a real need for approaches that make sense for the region and the local context.
Okay, thank you.
Particularly when we talk about these OECD alignments are related to each country's ambition to achieve full OECD membership. Personally, my concern would be how rushed each of these countries' regulators will work in coming up with their roadmaps or plans and policies with regards to chemicals management. Now, as long as the process engages industry all along the way to ensure that when these roadmaps are presented, and these policies are enforced into regulation, there are things that can be immediately or at least as efficiently as possible adopted by the industries. Only then could we consider these efforts by these respective countries in fulfilling their OECD ambition, make sense, and would enable them to become a better, position them better as an OECD member later on, when it comes to chemicals management. So this is what we will be looking into.
Okay. In the Philippines, we see a shift toward a risk-based approach for the priority chemicals list. What practical challenges do companies face in the chemical prioritization and specifically in the risk-based evaluation?
Right, so I think at this stage it remains to be fully implemented. EMB has published on their website their draft guidelines for prioritization, which I believe takes into consideration hazard as well as volume to come up with a score and priority score. They're yet to come up with a full risk assessment scheme. And I think we'll know more, but there's a number of challenges. I think industry sometimes would like to see a bit more consideration for exposure, even in the prioritization approach. And there's challenges from regulators to collect some of the information that would be needed. Like, for example, on the use profile, which is something that currently they cannot capture with the current data collection. So there's a number of things that could be done to improve, but what is also reassuring is they're very open in their communication. They're engaged with different industry stakeholders, which is, I think, a very good way to find the best solution and the best way forward. So we've yet to see what comes up for the risk assessment. As a representative for nickel producers, there is also a very strong desire and concern on how will they address inorganics. Those are substances that behave extremely different from organic substances, and there are a number of tools that are not appropriate to assess the exposure, the overall risk for metals in inorganics. And I think here it would be really good to see that they come up with acknowledgement for these specificities and the right way to look at risk for those substances. Also, there is always the discussion around the resources available. Will they have the resources to conduct themselves the risk assessment? Should they work more closely with industry and review potentially industry-led risk assessment? This is discussion that are, I think, ongoing. They seem to be leaning towards conducting the risk assessment themselves. But as I said, nothing is finalized yet.
What's your view on this?
Pretty much I echo the same what Fabien has mentioned earlier. As companies who are manufacturing also in the Philippines, clearly with these intents from the authorities, we do make our best to comply with and to ensure that a good framework is established. We do regularly engage, like my company through Speak, for instance, we are regularly active in here. And hopefully, the EMB will pay attention to the suggestions that we from the industry bring forward.
Environmental Management Bureau.
Correct.
From the Philippines. Fabien, if regulators are the ends, ASEAN is the colony. What are the key developments in the Asian Regulatory Cooperation Platform?
It is a very interesting years for the ARCP. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So a lot of things actually happening this year. We have our in-person workshop that we organize at the end of September, early October, which will be a really celebratory workshop. We have finalized guidance along the years on GHS implementation called the ASEAN 7. We have worked on streamlining best practice for the setting of chemical inventory, new substance notification. We developed a practical tool, which I believe was also the basis that was considered by Philippines when developing their approach, to prioritize the ASEAN priority screening tool. We have finalized new substance notification guidance as well as chemical risk assessment guidance, and we will kick off 2 new working groups to look at next steps. As I mentioned earlier, one of the drivers is sustainability, and we see scheme on EPR, extended producer responsibility, blooming everywhere. So a working group will address this part, and another one will continue on risk assessment and go a step further on what needs to be put as a regulatory process to select the appropriate risk management options based on the risk assessment outcome. And I think here the keywords are like how to develop a framework that is predictable, proportionate, and transparent. So on the work side of things, that's what we're doing, and we're also trying to improve our communication. We will probably have a stronger presence on LinkedIn, social media, having a better branding as well. So a lot of exciting things to come in the next few months.
Let's address the dinosaur in the room, the global harmonized system. Can GHS harmonization fully work across Southeast Asia, or are national differences still too strong?
How long do you have?
As long as you need.
It's I think it's a recurring topic, and that would require a lot of discussion. I think there's, especially in the region, in ASEAN and in the broader Asia Pacific, there's a lot of positive signs, a lot of engagement from industry, from government. In the ASEAN Regulatory Cooperation Platform, with the ASEAN 7 guidance, we have seen more uptake of Revision 7 in the region. So if you look at what's happening Indonesia with Revision 7, Singapore Revision 7, a few are looking at Revision 8, like the Philippines. We have Australia, New Zealand with Revision 7. There is some convergence around those revisions. Of course, the problem is it remains too easy to only look at the revision. You have to look at what are the building blocks implemented, what are the deadlines, what are the concentration limits, even the definition of concentration limit and cutoff value. We could go very deep into the details. What we see is that there's still many differences, and full alignment is quite unreasonable, or at least not realistic in the next few years. But what we've seen with ASEAN, with APEC, the previous chemical dialogue that was sunsetted last year, there was a lot of work around convergence. And what we're doing is really building this trust by enabling exchange, sharing session between government, industry, government to government, to fully understand what are the differences. Because if you look at the Purple Book, differences from revision 6, 7, and 8 are quite minor. And you can have more difference between 2 implementation of revision 7 than a revision 6 to revision 8. That could be more aligned. So you have to look at all those small differences, and what is being promoted right now is when a country look at revising or implementing GHS for the first time, have broader consideration than just which revision to look at. Look at what your neighbors are doing, your major trading partner, because we often forget that the one objective of GHS that is left behind is trade facilitation. And when countries start looking at what is happening, they can streamline their minimum requirement. This is the minimum requirement you need to do to comply with us. But then they can wonder, should we accept automatically element of GHS that goes slightly beyond these minimum requirements? Maybe you don't accept acute tox category 5, and maybe your neighbor is requesting it. So if an SDS is prepared with a classification with acute tox 5, it doesn't compromise the level of protection in your own country. You could consider accepting it automatically. And those set of principles that we defined in APEC as mutual acceptance, and that we took over as well in the ASEAN Regulatory Cooperation Platform, were streamlined by a project in Indonesia that developed a guidance, a checklist on how to revise, what are the elements to consider when revising GHS. Same checklist is also available in the ASEAN 7+ guidance document. So there is a lot of promising direction this is taking. The discussion is here. But when you zoom out, you see a lot of other things happening. You see Europe with new hazard classes. You see the discussion ongoing at the UN level. So it's quite hard to be fully optimistic, and we're doing what we can at this level to really enhance this cooperation and convergence for GHS implementation.
Okay, no, thanks a lot for this lecture. I think we can indeed continue this for hours, but let's move to the final question. What is the most effective compliance strategy for companies operating across Southeast Asia?
This is a very good question and a very tricky question as well, I would say. Because at the end of the day, companies are different, yeah? They have different outlooks, they have different presence in the region as well. Some companies have presence in each of the Southeast Asia countries, business-wise. But when it comes to support services that are there to ensure companies comply with the regulations, for example, you may not have a local guy in each of the country you operate. They may set up a service center concept, a shared service center concept in one single location within the region to support the entire region. And these cause different ways based on how the companies are set up in the first place. But still, I would say there are some basic principles that, at least in experience, we've seen do help companies operating in the region, such as like centralizing your regulatory intelligence works, to do the environmental landscape tracking and monitoring of regulations, also standardizing some basic processes, and centralizing them so that it all can be executed efficiently. Also, I would add to that, clearly having local, if you can't be locally present, then at least build your local network, so that you won't miss out on things as well. So at the very least, these are the things that I can advise at the moment on what can constitute best practices for any company setup operating within Southeast Asia.
Right. I fully agree with what Anas mentioned. I think in a more generic approach is like the first thing is to be well informed, is to know what's coming. And the best way to do this, I'm a strong advocate, of course, of regulatory cooperation, and this can take different forms. It can be industry to government, it can be industry to industry. Engage with your local association. It's usually a great way to talk with peers on best practices. What are they doing? What do they see? It's also the best way to have engagement with regulators usually. And having this discussion is crucial, I think, to be well informed, because you start becoming aware of their challenges and you can anticipate better. But then there's also cooperation, government to government. It can take different forms, but in any case, I think being engaged is very important. And usually, at least in this region, working with your local association is very important to stay informed of what's coming, what's happening, and what you can do, how you can contribute.
Anas and Fabien, thank you for your insights. One message for industry: anticipate, don't react, because in Southeast Asia, regulations don't wait, they roll out.